She was this gun-toting, whiskey-drinking broad.
The super epic fucking broad.
She was a pioneer in the industry.
She's also so famous and so controversial.
So controversial.
So she's kind of a big fucking deal.
Her story is so incredible. She belongs on this podcast because she's a broad you should know. Hello and welcome to Broads You Should Know, the podcast about amazing and noteworthy women from history. I am your host, Sarah Gorski, and I'm here today with a special new guest for you, audience. I'm here with Ms. Heather Pringle. Hi, Heather.
Hi, how are you doing? I'm honored to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you. Audience, Heather is, among many things, a writer, and she has a book coming out called The Northwomen, Untold Stories from the Other Half of the Viking World. Heather, okay, first of all, we love Viking women on this podcast. Olga of Kiev is one of our favorite women we've ever covered. When I say we, I mean me. She's one of my favorites.
One of mine too.
How did you get interested in Viking women? Why are you writing about Viking women? What's your story?
Well, my story is I'm an archaeology writer. So I write a lot about archaeology. But my favorite thing in the world to do is to combine archaeology and history. And when you do that, sometimes you can discover these, kind of create these amazing portraits of ancient people. And I absolutely love doing that. And I got into Viking women because, I don't know, some time ago, about maybe 10 years ago, something like that, I went to a conference in Oslo in Norway. And as part of the conference, the people attending the conference were whisked away on this tour to the Viking Ship Museum. And I thought, how cool is this, the Viking Ship Museum? And one of the most incredible parts of the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo was this huge ship. It was a Viking longship, incredibly carved. And it turned out that it was the burial, a ship burial that contained the bodies of two women. And it is, yes, this ship was towed out of the water. And then it was buried under an earthen mound. And there was a chamber inside that contained the skeletons of two women. And this is the most lavish grave ever discovered in the Viking world. In other words,
wow,
the most lavish grave in the Viking world honored two women.
That's interesting, because in my understanding of Viking culture, it was mostly like the kings, the Viking warriors and kings that were buried that way. And their women were sometimes like buried with them on the pyre. But that's interesting that they were women.
No, exactly. You're not alone in thinking that, because in fact, they used to call these big giant mounds king's mounds. I mean, it never occurred to early archaeologists, 19th century archaeologists, that there could be women in these mounds. So I took a look at the exhibits. There were just some phenomenal things found in this grave of these two women. The ship, which had these magnificent carvings, even below the waterline, which just blew my mind. But there were also, there was a carved carriage, just all in wood, and just with these kind of weird, fantastical creatures carved into it. There was tapestries. There was a bucket that people now call the Buddha bucket, only because it doesn't seem to have anything to do with Buddha at all. But on the handle, there's these little bronze figurines of a little man sitting in lotus position. So there's two of these on this bucket. So they call it a Buddha bucket, but that's just a descriptive term. Anyway, there were all these treasures found on this ship. And the more I wandered around the museum that day, the more fascinated I got. Like, why have I never heard of these two women, the Oseberg women? The ship was found in a place called Oseberg, a farm called Oseberg in Norway, just on the Oslo fjord. And I thought, well, why the heck have I never heard anything about these women? Because I'm really interested in archaeology. What's going on?
Yeah.
So I went home and I started looking into it. And I was able to find something about the Oseberg women. But I could find very little about Viking women generally. And again, I thought, well, that's kind of strange. Like, the standard image of Viking women is, homemakers and mothers and wives. But, powerful Viking women, like the two women buried in the ship, very, very little. Very little was being said or about it. So I thought, well, this is interesting. I would like to write about this, but I would at the time, and I was a freelance writer, and I didn't have time to pursue it. But
Yeah.
roughly, 7 years ago, 7 years ago, I did have an opportunity to pursue it. National Geographic. I just done a big story on the Vikings for National Geographic magazine, and they said, "Well, what do you think about a book? Would you like to write a book?" And I remembered these women, the Oseberg women, and eventually I said to them, "I think there'd be a great book here on Viking women." So that's the origin story of the book. That's the origin story. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
And am I correct when I am recalling recently, or more recently, I think in the last decade or so, they've discovered more and more skeletons of buried warriors that were women? And they've
yeah,
realized that more Viking women were warriors than they originally thought. Of course, the Viking warriors were men, but women did fight alongside the men, right?
yeah. That's absolutely correct. And in fact, again, a lot of very conservative traditional archaeologists in Scandinavia completely dismissed the idea that there were real Viking women warriors. They said, well, that's just one of the old saga stories. And, this idea that there were shield maidens, how could that possibly be? Because what's more macho than a Viking male warrior? I mean, what's more macho than that? A big shield, the battle axe over his shoulder and everything. How could a woman possibly, how could that possibly happen? How could a woman enter the battlefield? And there were these poetic descriptions of Viking warfare that were just horrifying, absolutely horrifying. The blood and the spears flying and the arrows. I mean, it just did. In the minds of most conservative archaeologists, male archaeologists, that was no place for a woman. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. But what happened about 5 years, well, no, pardon me, about 7 years ago, is that some archaeologists in Sweden decided to do, as part of another study, decided to do some DNA testing. And they did a DNA test on what was the iconic burial of a Viking male warrior. And it was this very, very famous burial in a place called Birka in Sweden. And this warrior was buried with swords and shields and spears and just everything that a warrior, two horses, everything that a warrior should be buried with. This individual had been buried with. And it turned out when they did the DNA testing, Viking woman. It was a Viking woman. It was so cool
The whole time. It was a
the
woman
whole
the whole
time.
time.
And so a lot of people have started, rethinking this idea. So long story short, we're starting to get this view of Viking women doing a lot of things that we would have thought, not me personally, but a lot of archaeologists thought were extremely unlikely. So
Yeah.
it's cool stuff.
It's so cool.
Yeah.
It's so cool. I remember reading that news article and thinking like, this is the most exciting thing ever. And I'm not going to lie to you. And obviously I know it's fictional, but the TV show Vikings that ran for a few years had this great female centric character, Lagatha.
Lagatha, yeah.
She was in battle with everybody. And like, I loved the heck out of that show. That was like, no, the first couple seasons. I have a lot to say about the later seasons, but those early seasons when she's kind of toe to toe in battle with the
Oh, yeah.
guys, it was awesome. And
Yeah, it's exciting to think that women were there. And what I learned actually from talking to archaeologists is that they now feel that if women, and I totally believe this, that if women were given really thorough training from a young age, they could be trained to fight hand-to-hand combat against larger warriors. It's all in the training and the skill and the speed and so on. And it's now looking like that woman warrior in that iconic warrior grave, the one that we have the DNA for, she may have fought as a mounted warrior. So she may have fought on horseback.
Yeah.
With the Eastern style bows, these very fast bows, very fast to load and so on. The arrows just fly out of them. So it looks like that may be the way that she fought on the battlefield. So there are lots of ways for a woman to enter battle. So yeah, we're just starting to open our eyes. I think what's happened is that archaeologists are starting to realize, hey, maybe there's more to Viking women than what we originally thought. They're opening their eyes. They're starting to ask a lot of questions about women, which I think is great. High time.
Yeah, it seems like we're entering an era, partially at least, obviously we're in an era, but it seems like there's starting to be a better understanding that previous historical findings were very colored by the systems that existed in the time period that they were, quote, discovered. So male historians assuming women couldn't fight and wouldn't fight, and so they weren't looking for women in combat history. And now as they start to do these things and these tests, and they figure, it's starting to, like, I think there's more and more discoveries like that where people are realizing, that's part of the reason we started this podcast. And in the original, it was like, we asked the question, we don't see a lot of women like in our history classes in school and things like that. So like, did women do things? Were they allowed to do things? And as we've done research, we find, oh yes, women's fingerprints are all over the entire history of the world. Their stories just aren't being told by the most often male historians. So
no, that's absolutely right. And I think actually what I really believe is that a lot of Viking women were just airbrushed out of history, because at the time during the Viking Age, which was, AD 750 to around AD 10, late 1000s, they were, it was a time when most of the writers were male. Literacy wasn't exclusively a male phenomenon, but there were a lot of men who were, writing, histories and chronicles and so on. And they weren't interested in women. They just, they weren't interested at all.
Yeah. But here we are. And now you have brought us, obviously, Viking woman today. You're going to be talking, who are you talking about today?
I am talking about Gudrid the Well-Traveled.
Gudrid the Well-Traveled.
Gudrid the Well-Traveled. I just love that. A lot of the very interesting Viking women towards the end of the Viking Age got these little descriptors on, attached to their first name, like Gudrid the Well-Traveled. There's another one called Oder the Deep-Minded, which is one of my favorite names. But anyway, Gudrid the Well-Traveled, she was indeed a very, very well-traveled woman. She was born, I'm just going to give you just a very brief summary, first of all, and then we can start to explore this a bit. But she was born in around about the AD 990. So AD 990, towards the, Okay. And then she died around probably around AD 1080. So it's thought that she lived 90 years, which is way beyond the life expectancy of most Viking women. Okay, so she was born during this period. So the reason why I mention these dates and why I think they're so important, because if you think about it, that's more than 500 years, or almost 500 years before Columbus. And yet, Gudrid the Well-Traveled traveled to the shores of Canada. So she actually was part of a Viking expedition that went from Greenland to the shores of Canada. Wow. Yeah, 500, almost 500 years before Columbus. And then, so she did that when she was a fairly young woman. She gave birth to the first known European child in North America. And then she, in her later life, she then went on, she was a Christian woman. So it was an era when Christianity was starting to make real inroads in Scandinavia and in, the Viking colonies in Iceland and Greenland. Anyway, she went on a pilgrimage in the latter part of her life to Rome. So she went from Iceland by ship to Denmark. And then from Denmark, she traveled all the way to Rome on pilgrimage. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So by the end of her life, she was probably the most well-traveled woman on the planet. That comes from a very renowned Viking scholar, Neil Price, who is a professor of archaeology at Uppsala University in Sweden. So she is enormously well-traveled, really quite fascinating. So,
and were those warships that she was traveling on, or was she just on ships? Was she a warrior?
She was on ships. I think they were more merchant ships that she was traveling on. Yeah, Viking merchant ships is what she was traveling on for both of those journeys. But do you want to dig into this a little bit?
Yeah, let's dig in. And just because we have covered Olga on this podcast,
Yeah.
Are they contemporaries? They're close to the same time period,
They are
right?
close to the same time period. Yes, they are. Yes, they are. So as I say, it's a period in which Christianity has started to make inroads. That's not to say there weren't still Vikings that adhered to the old pagan religion of the Norse gods and goddesses and so on, and we'll come to that a little bit with Gudrid. But it was a time when a lot of Viking, I think, men and women were looking beyond their homelands, and certainly for the Vikings, they were colonizing lands both in the east, so in what is now Russia and Ukraine. They were setting up little settlements in Russia and Ukraine, but they were also colonizing some of the North Atlantic islands. So, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and eventually, very briefly, but they were in Canada, in Newfoundland, as we'll see, in the province of what's called Newfoundland and Labrador. So, yeah, so her career is during that same period that Olga of Kiev lived.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, let's tell me more about Gudrid. Who is she? Or was she?
I don't know. I always think of her almost in the present tense, but that's
kind of always do in the podcast too. I always talk about them as if they're
yeah, because I don't know. Anyway, she's very much on my mind. But okay, so she's a really important figure in the Viking world. She is so important that, in fact, she plays a major part in two of the Icelandic sagas. Now, the sagas were oral stories that were told and passed down for sometimes generations before they were written down. And in the case of the two sagas that Gudrid is in were the Vinland sagas. And you may have heard of Vinland. It's what the Vikings called part of North America. They called it Vinland. And I can tell you a little bit about why that was, but let's not get too distracted with that just yet. So anyway, she's a major figure in two of the really important Icelandic sagas, the Vinland sagas. So what we know about her, she was born, I think I said this already, born around AD 990. She was born either in Norway or in Iceland. Because the Viking colonists had started settling Iceland at that point. And we don't know for sure where she was born, but certainly by her early teens, let's say, she was living in Iceland with her father, and with her, she was coming under the care of a foster mother. We don't know what happened to her mother, but she was being raised by a foster mother. And interestingly, her foster mother was a pagan, so believed in the Old Norse gods and so on. But her father was a devout Christian. So Gudrid was well versed in the Old Norse ways, but she was also a Christian by virtue of her own personal faith. Anyway, she her father basically decides when he is in Iceland that he would like to become an immigrant. And this is an immigrant to Greenland. Now, there was one of his friends, one of Gudrid's father's friends, Eric the Red, and you may have heard of him. Eric the Red had lived in Iceland and had gone exploring further west to Greenland. And just a little bit about Greenland, because it's important. Greenland, it's a huge island. It's the world's largest island, and it's largely covered in ice. I mean, it's very thick ice. But around the coast, there's this band of green, and it's sort of it's certainly habitable, and you can actually grow some crops along that coastal area. So Eric the Red did some exploring around there and decided he really liked what he saw, because there were lots of resources there. There was, basically ivory. There were lots of walruses living in Greenland. And the walrus ivory was really valuable. It could be sold in Europe, and artists carved it and so on. It was a really valuable commodity. So, and there was lots of game and so on. So Eric the Red really liked what he saw in Greenland. He went back to Iceland and told all the Icelanders, hey, let's, I think you should come with me. We're going to start a new settlement, a new colony in Greenland. So he took initially 25 to 30 Viking ships with him. And the journey was kind of a disaster because only 14 of them actually made it to Greenland. The other ships either sunk or, they were forced back to Iceland by really severe storms. So I mention this because these trips across the water between Iceland and Greenland were dangerous. They could be quite dangerous. And, a safe arrival was never guaranteed. So, but anyway, Gudrid's father, this chieftain, decided he wasn't part of the first wave, but he thought, okay, I would like to migrate there. I've heard enough good things about Greenland that I think, I should take my family and about, my retainers and so on, and we should emigrate to Greenland. So, Gudrid, of course, was probably too young to have much of a say in this. And she gets packed into one of these Viking merchant ships. And I just have this picture in my mind of what that might have been like. So the merchant ship, maybe two merchant ships, I don't know, one or two, and it would have some livestock in it. So, some young calves, it would have some sheep, lambs, goats, that kind of thing. So animals and people and stormy waters and, probably a lot of seasickness.
Probably. Those are not smooth sailing waters as far as I understand.
No. And the Viking ships, these were open ships. I don't think we can say enough about that. It's not a comfortable way of traveling. The ships are open. I interviewed a fellow who was a captain of one of the replicas Viking ships that the Viking Ship Museum in Denmark has built. And he said, you are wet all the time in those ships. And those journeys, those long journeys, you're wet, you're cold, and it's very hard to get warm.
When you say open ship, you mean like there's no like rooms below, right? It's
there's
just
no
like this
rooms
open
below.
deck.
There's no cabin. There.
Did they light fires for heat? Like, what do they have to do something, right?
Well, they have sea blankets, and they're very heavy wool, and wool is actually kind of a good material for sea voyages because it can absorb a lot of water and yet still remain quite warm, believe it or not. So they would have had, Gudrid and her family would have had these probably sea blankets and warm woolen clothing, but it's not going to be a nice trip. It's not. Definitely not.
How long are we talking? Like a few weeks?
Well, we might well be talking something like that. To be honest, I don't really know, but it's going to be long. It's going to be long enough so that you're not comfortable and you're just wishing that the whole thing was.
It's
over.
not like 2 days. It's not like taking a train or something.
No, it's nothing like that. So anyway, but they do get to Greenland. Although one story has it that they were shipwrecked at one point. But, researchers kind of debate it back and forth. There's no consensus on it. So she may have been shipwrecked at one point. Anyway, they make it to the most southernmost tip of Greenland, and they end up for the winter in the home of a very prosperous landowner. And something really interesting happens there to Gudrid when she's there. She and her father and her father's retainers are being taken in by this large landowner in Greenland and into his home. And, but there's a famine in Greenland at the time. I mean, this is not a great trip, right? So there's a famine in Greenland. Everyone's kind of starving. And the large landowner invites a sorceress to his home. He invites her. Now sorceresses were women, very high status women. They were powerful women, and they were treated with a lot of respect. And so we have an account in one of the sagas, Eric the Red saga, about this sorceress being invited to the farmer's home, the landowner's home. And so she turns up. She's got this incredible outfit on. She's just unlike anything that most other women wore. She had this long blue coat that was trimmed with, it said, stones, probably some kind of gemstone, I'm guessing, all the way down to her feet. She's got these shoes on that have these brass knobs that probably tinkled when she walked. She had a belt around her waist with a pouch that contained her magic amulets. And most importantly of all, she had a staff in her hand. And the staff was decorated with these bronze knobs all the way around. And if you think of a staff, think of a little bit like kind of a sturdy magical wand. I mean, it was a magical tool. It was a tool of magic that she carried. So she came to the landowner's home. They welcomed her with great respect and everything. Gudrid was part of the household. She saw all this, and they gave her the best seat at the table, and then they fed her. Okay, again, this is a famine. This is how a sorceress would be treated. It was a terrible famine. And they brought her a meat dish, which is kind of weird. This is kind of weird. It contained the hearts of every animal in that region. So they had butchered, I don't know how many animals, to remove the hearts, cook them for her, and put them all on her plate so she could be well fed. So that was her dinner. And then after the farmer had really fed her well, he said, "Well, the reason why we invited you here is we'd like to know when the famine's going to end, and are we going to be okay? Basically, are we going to be okay?" And she said, "Well, I'll give you my answer tomorrow." So she went to sleep. She went to sleep. She got up the next morning and she said to the farmer, "Okay, but I have certain conditions, certain things that I need here before I can perform my ceremony, right?"
Okay.
And yeah, I have certain conditions. So anyway, one of the conditions was she needed a group of women who knew the old Norse songs that one sang during a sorcery ceremony. And so the landowner asked around in his house, anyone here know the songs? Anyone? And the only one who knew the songs was Gudrid, because her foster mother had been a pagan. And so the landowner went to Gudrid and he said, "Hey, I know you're a Christian, but would you mind singing these songs? We've got the sorceress here. This is what she wants." And Gudrid said, "Well, I do know the songs. My foster mother taught me, but I don't want to sing them because I'm a very good Christian. I don't want to sing them. I'm very sorry, And the landowner, I think he was kind of astonished that someone would probably dig in her heels like that Gudrid would dig in her heels. But anyway, long story short, she was eventually persuaded. I think, the sense that this landowner provided all this hospitality to them, I'm sure she just, it was a sort of pragmatic, and it's being like, I've got to be a good guest now to this man who's been so nice to us. So anyway, they have the ceremony. The sorceress is, seated, and all around her, well, Gudrid is there and sings the songs. And they say in the saga that the people in the great hall where this was performed had never heard anyone sing them so beautifully as Gudrid. Gudrid sang just beautifully. So the sorceress did her, she kind of went into a trance state. She summoned spirits and asked them, what's going to happen here? Are these people going to die in the famine, or will the famine end soon? All that kind of stuff. And found the answers, and then came back to herself and announced to the hall what she had learned, that the famine would soon be over and everyone would be okay. And Gudrid was going to make 2 really great marriages and be a very highly respected woman, is what she said. So this was the prophecy. This was the prophecy that she delivered.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, no, it's kind of interesting. So in the spring, Gudrid and her dad went to voyage to the home of Eric the Red. And he had a home in a place called Brattahlid in Greenland. It was a big estate, probably the biggest and most lavish estate in Greenland, because he was the paramount chief. He was the guy that convinced everybody else to move there. So he took the best land. And by the time that Gudrid and her father arrived, Eric the Red was dead, but he had three sons, Leif Erikson, who I'm going to come back to, and then two others. But the youngest, I think he was the youngest son, Thorstein, took a fancy to Gudrid. And this was a very kind of important family, right? He took a fancy to Gudrid, asked for a hand, and the two of them married. So Leif, it was all very well and good. And then what happened was that Thorstein decided he wanted to go exploring. His older brother, Leif Erikson, had made a journey to North America and was the first Viking to set foot on North American soil. This had happened around the year 10,000 or so, something like that, maybe give or take, something like that. But again, long before Columbus. And anyway, so Leif Erikson, when his father died, when Eric the Red died, he became the paramount chief of Greenland, and he had too many responsibilities. He couldn't go exploring anymore. So he started kind of delegating that responsibility to members of his family. And one of them was Thorstein. So Thorstein and Gudrid set off for North America, but they don't make it for, and I don't think it's entirely clear what happens to them. They can't make, they have a problem of some sort, and they have to come back to Greenland. When they get back, Thorstein has contracted some illness. He contracts some terrible illness, and he dies.
Oh.
So Thorstein dies, and Gudrid is, this young widow at Brattahlid in the estate of Eric the Red. But that fall, what happens is that her, a very kind of young, wealthy Icelandic trader turns up at Brattahlid, and he is smitten with Gudrid. Gudrid is always described as the fairest of women. She's described as, very dignified.
Yeah. And a great singer.
Yeah, but she's tough. I'd say dignified but tough, actually, would be a good way of putting it. So he asked Gudrid to marry him, and she agrees, and she does marry him. And she still harbors this desire to go to North America. She really wants to go. She's heard stories about it from Leif Erikson. She wants to go. So she and her new husband, and his name is Thorfinn Karlsefni. It's interesting that so many of these Icelandic names, they start with the word Thor. And
one of their gods, right?
Yeah, exactly. But it's how many of individuals in Gudrid's life have the name that starts with Thor. Anyway, she and Thorfinn Karlsefni head off to North America in the spring, and they have a very kind of crazy, eventful time there. They go there, really crazy, eventful time. They go there. Leif Erikson has loaned him his camp that he built in North America, which is so interesting. Oh yeah, he won't give it to anybody, but he'll loan it to members of his own family. So they get there, and they set up shop in his camp, and they almost immediately start doing a lot of exploring. Like they go there. I think it's with a party of I think it's 30 men and 5 women, or 30 men and 5 women. And they start exploring for resources, things that could be valuable to bring back to Greenland. Basically, it all seems to be going rather well. They get the first visit from an indigenous group. An indigenous group turns up at the Leif Erikson's camp, and they come. One of the men has a pack sack on his back. It's filled with thick furs, luxury furs that would be highly desirable in European eyes. Oh man, I'd like to wear those thick furs in winter. Anyway, so this indigenous man comes with a pack sack, with the furs, but he wants to trade for iron weapons. And Thorfinn thinks, no, 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 we're not going to give these indigenous people here iron weapons in case there's problems, because then they could be fighting us with these iron weapons. So instead, he asked Gudrid to bring out dairy products. So, like, so she brings out, I think, butter, and she brings out, milk and so on. And so these indigenous group, seem to be happy with the dairy products, and they leave the furs behind. And after eating some of the dairy products, they disappear. They back into the woods. Okay, but so that first visit, very, very peaceful, right? Really great. Everyone leaves. Everyone's pretty happy about it. But there is a second visit, not so peaceful. It turns really violent, as a matter of fact. I'm just laughing at your cat.
I know. Penelope decided she's going to be in this episode too. You can't really deny her when she wants something; she has to have it.
Of course not. Of course not. Think about
I'm
it.
interested in Gudrid's story. What happened? What happened with the camp? So they're attacked this time?
They're attacked, and they're attacked by quite a large force. Apparently, the dairy products didn't really cut the mustard for them. They really wanted something more. So anyway, they get attacked by a very large party the second time. And what happens is that Gudrid's sister-in-law, Freydis, who is a bit of a fireball kind of woman, really. Oh yeah, she is not taking any crap from anybody. So she starts calling out to the Viking men, who seem to be getting the worst of the fighting. They're not really able to hold off the indigenous party, and she starts yelling at them and saying, I'm sure I could fight better than any of you, and just really starts yelling at all the Viking men. And the Viking men, are just ignoring her. They take off into the woods, hoping to, shake off the indigenous warriors. And the local warriors follow them into the woods. Freydis comes running after them. She picks up the sword of a dead Viking man. There's a dead Viking man on the ground. She picks up the sword. She holds it up. Then she rips back her chemise, and she starts slapping the flat part of the blade against her breast. And it's weird, eh? Like flat. But it frightens the indigenous guys. They've probably never seen a woman do anything like that.
Gosh.
She could have been sort of the wild woman of the woods or something. They didn't know who she was, but she was behaving in a very bizarre fashion with this iron sword in her hand. So they take off, but so it ends fairly well, thanks to Freydis. But the difficulty is that Thorfinn knows that they don't have enough people to hold, to hold off another larger attack. It's only a matter of time before there's another larger attack.
Right.
And moreover, Gudrid is pregnant. So she's pregnant at this point. So what happens is he builds a kind of he builds a little bit of a wall around their settlement, but he decides in the spring they're going to, and with Gudrid's agreement, she's given birth at this point to a little boy called Snorri.
Snorri.
Yeah, Snorri.
Oh, wee Viking boy.
a very wee Viking boy. Anyway, so she agrees. They go back to, they give up their encampment and they go back to Iceland. And so this is a great, it's a great story, right? Is there any truth in it? Because there's a lot of things that sound pretty strange, Freydis, a lot of things that sound a little bit.
And this is all from the saga, as you said, right?
No, these stories are from the sagas. These are from the sagas.
But they're also like epic tales that probably got retold and exaggerated and
exactly.
Right?
No, that's exactly right. But in the 1960s, two archaeologists from Norway came to Newfoundland and started trying to find Leif Erikson's camp, and they found a very likely candidate in Newfoundland at a place called Lanso Meadows. And then what happened was there was a team of Canadians and Canadians and Norwegians together. And on this team was one of my absolute heroes. Her name is Brigida Wallace, and she's now 80. And I had the incredible pleasure of meeting her at a site, a possible Viking site in Newfoundland. And she carried a bag. Bag was pink, and it said, "Treat me like a queen." And I just, and I loved it. I loved her. I thought she was just fantastic. And so she started to lead the excavations at Lanso Meadows. She found the first evidence of women at this Leif Erikson's camp, which was a spindle whorl that women used to spin wool. And so she found that. There was a couple of other pieces of evidence. There was, I'll tell you a little bit about what Lance O'Mallus would have looked like at Gudrid's time in a minute, but the evidence for women is fairly small, like it's a spindle whorl. There was a little whetstone, they called it, which was a file that women used to file their needles to make them very sharp. And it was usually found in a woman's sewing kit. And then the third thing that they found that indicated women were there, well, there were a couple more, but anyway, the third thing, concrete artifact, was a bone needle that was used for what's called single needle knitting. So it was used for a very special kind of knitting that the Viking women did. So, yeah, so we know for a fact, well, we have very, very good evidence that there were women at Lanso Meadows, really good evidence that they were there.
Is that site probably the oldest evidence of Europeans on the continent?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, and this, yeah, exactly. So, but what was cool was when they start really excavating the whole site, they found 3 large hall buildings that kind of were built in the traditional Icelandic kind of way. And the largest one was a building called what they called Hall F. And they gave each building an alphabetic label. And Hall F had 3 sleeping chambers in a row. I've just found this interesting because it kind of sheds light. Hall F was the largest of the buildings. It would have been a place where a leader of an expedition, Viking expedition, slept.
Yeah.
Gudrid and Thorfinn were leaders of an expedition. It's so easy to see them. Certainly Brigida, after 40 years of excavation and analysis at Lanso Meadows, she is convinced that this is Leif Erikson's base camp. She's absolutely convinced. And she Hall F, so a row of 3 sleeping chambers. There's a small private one with a fireplace in it. That would have been for the chieftain and his significant other. I mean, we can imagine that's certainly where Gudrid and Thorfinn, we can imagine them sleeping there easily. There would have been another larger communal space with sleeping benches along the wall and a central fireplace. That would have been for their retainers and, people of lesser rank. And then a smaller room that had a few sleeping benches and a latrine in the corner. So, I mean, that wasn't for the elite people there. That was, for other people. And then just to one side, there was a very small, what's called a pit house, very small. It was partly dug into the ground. And there was a small oven that had a special kind of ovens that was built so that sparks wouldn't fly out of it. It is very likely a weaving hut, a place that was forbidden it was a woman's space. It was taboo for men to enter a weaving hut. If they entered a woman's weaving hut, bad things would happen to a man. According to traditional Viking beliefs, Norse beliefs, bad things would happen. So, and it had a whole bunch of weights piled in the corner. Those could have been fishing weights because they were stones with holes drilled in the middle for a cord to be strung through. They could be, but it could also be that they were weights for a loom, for a woman's loom. for weaving. And I really strongly believe, based on the archaeological evidence that we have to date, that it is a weaving shed. I think it's a weaving shed. That type of oven is, that was meant so that sparks wouldn't fly out while a weaver was weaving her cloth and end up on the cloth burning a hole in it. So yeah, so
That's so interesting.
yeah, so we've got good evidence that this was a place where women lived for a period of time. We don't know how long. Lancel Meadows doesn't seem to have been occupied for decades or anything like that. It seems to have been occupied for years, and one wonders if the indigenous indigenous presence was starting to get increasingly hostile. The Vikings may have just decided, hey, we can't fully occupy this site. We don't have enough people
Yeah.
from Greenland, which is the nearest place. Greenland wasn't a big colony to begin with, so they just decided to abandon it. So anyway, that's really good evidence for women at Lancel Meadows. We can see Gudrid and Thorfinn there. It's easy to see that
Yeah.
one's imagination. I don't want to say it's absolutely proven beyond doubt. That wouldn't be right, but it's easy to kind of imagine that.
Is that the last we hear of Gudrid's story, that she has the
No.
baby?
Yeah, she has the baby. She goes back to Iceland, and she goes back to Iceland with Thorfinn. They live on a farm, and she lives there for 20 years or 20 odd years or something like that. And then Thorfinn dies, and Gudrid's kind of a free woman. She's wealthy. She's wealthy because they have a very prosperous farm. She's upper class. She's high status because Thorfinn is high status and was wealthy. And she decides she'd like to do some more traveling. And so she goes on a pilgrimage. She goes on a Christian pilgrimage. She sails from Iceland to Denmark. And then she probably joins a party of pilgrims and treks for over 1,000 miles from Denmark all the way down to Rome. She ends up in Rome. You can see, you kind of imagine her walking the streets of Rome, these incredible Christian churches with the mosaics, the frescoes. I mean, it would have been just mind-boggling for a young girl who'd grown up in Iceland, who'd been to Greenland, who'd been to North America. Now she's in Rome. And Neil Price, again, who is one of the leading authorities on the Vikings, says he thinks that she likely had an audience with the Pope, because at this period of time, the popes were very interested in what was happening in the outside world. Very high status person from Iceland would have been a rare bird indeed for in Rome. But even rare, a woman who had been to North America, this place that was beyond the edge of the known world for most of Europe.
Yeah.
So Neil thinks that she probably may have had an audience with the Pope. So she spends time in Rome. She then does the pilgrim, walks or travels back to Denmark, and then takes the ship to Iceland, and becomes, for the rest of her life, a nun and a religious recluse in a little church that her son Snorri built for her on the farm. So that's Gudrid's story, which I think is just mind-boggling, actually.
Wow. That's just, I mean, there's not really other, besides Olga, there's not really a lot of other parallel stories of women in such like prominent leadership. Like, she wasn't a leadership, I guess, but she was high class and traveling, and like,
yeah,
that's amazing.
I mean, she had a mind of her own. No one would have been able to force her to go to the New World. This was clearly something that she wanted to do. This was not something like someone was dragging her there. No, she would have had a say in this.
Yeah.
And she, it's not unknown in trading families, in trading households, for both the husband and the wife to be involved in trading activities. So it may be that she went with her husband, Thorfinn, to America and I promised it Vinland, which refers to an area where wild grapes were said to have grown, and there are, anyway. I
Yeah.
mean,
Wow.
there is evidence to suggest that they did go to some parts of a little bit further south than Newfoundland. So anyway, yeah. So anyway, she was really an astonishing woman, and she didn't have to go to North America. She clearly wanted to, and she just was adventurous. She was curious. She was able to deal with hardship. The hardships of travel at that time, which would have been considerable, like the pilgrimage routes, were just full of thieves and bandits and so on. So, yeah.
Well, and I'm guessing, the settlement in Newfoundland would not have been as fancy as where she came from, right? It's not quite as established, right? It was like a newer colony and
Definitely
didn't have the luxuries that
No.
probably they enjoyed back home a little more.
No, probably not. I mean, they wouldn't. No, probably not. I mean, the building itself would have been like the Hall F, the one that the expedition leaders would have stayed in. It was a big building. It was an impressively large building for the time, and it would have, I think, been suitable for a Viking lord in Greenland. So, I mean,
interesting.
Yeah.
Wow, she's so interesting, Heather.
I know, she's cool. She's really cool.
What a cool chick. So I have a question. Like, obviously, this is speculation. I love to speculate.
Sure. Go ahead, be my guest.
On the minds of these women. I think back to that woman, to the sorceress. I think you called her, right?
Yeah.
And like what her prediction for Gudrid, and like whether or not, like the chicken or the egg. Like, did she say that to help Gudrid move into kind of a more prominent position in Gudrid's life, or did she? It's always interesting to me that like that's a case of women empowering women in a way, like in its own way, obviously with the Norse religious overtones and things like that. But I find that piece of the story really interesting.
Well, I do too, and I think she was certainly grateful to Gudrid in the sense that Gudrid was able to sing the songs that helped the sorceress, summon the spirits and draw them close, because the whole thing apparently, well, not the whole thing, but an important part of the sort of experiences that these sorceresses had was to, try to draw the spirits closer so that she could speak and talk to them and ask them questions and so on. And Gudrid facilitated that. Gudrid helped with that, even though it was against Gudrid's principles. I find it really interesting. Yeah. I mean, Gudrid was helping her, and I feel like, who knows, maybe the sorceress was helping Gudrid too.
Yeah. I'm gonna hold on to that speculation for myself. Or like, yeah, she was helping Gudrid out because Gudrid helped her out.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so, Heather, thank you so much for bringing Gudrid. I didn't know anything about her. What an interesting woman.
Yeah, no, I think she's fascinating. I really do.
Yeah, very unlike anyone of her. I mean, there's not a lot of other women in the sagas, right?
Well, there are women in the sagas, but the problem is that it's really hard to come up with. And for a long time, people just kind of dismissed a lot of what was said in the sagas as being fanciful and fictional. But increasingly, as researchers, archaeologists, and others have started looking at the sagas and then looking for is there any archaeological evidence that supports this,
Yeah.
And we go back to the women warrior that we were talking about initially, the idea that there were women who were actually shield maidens, pardon me, or warriors. And initially people thought, no way, that could never have happened. But archaeology has really helped us fill in the blanks. And oh yes, there does seem to have been women that were capable of doing that.
Yeah. Well, and that sort of pattern is true, I think, in the stories we've seen throughout the world on this podcast. It was not specifically the Viking oral tradition. There were many of these traditions all across the world where, was it mythos? Was it myth, or was it real? And it's hard to really know. I mean, we might never know in some of these cases because these stories are very old, but.
Yeah. But if we can find some archaeology that backs them up, I mean, it's certainly worth giving some serious thought to, I think. And I don't think they can just be swept away and dismissed. I think we have to actually consider them. If we have other lines of evidence that we can draw in to support that, then I think we have to consider it.
Absolutely. So did you write about Gudrid? Is she included in your book, The Northwomen?
She is. Yes, she is. Yes,
and
she
this book comes out soon, right?
Yeah, it comes out September 10th.
Oh my gosh, that's just about a month away from today.
Yeah.
A month and a day. Are you very excited?
I am excited about it. It was a long project, but I learned so much, and I was fascinated by the women. And I just love the idea that maybe we're bringing some of the women, back into the light of day. And I really think that's an important thing to do. I think that we can't just turn to the old assumptions that women were, homemakers. And I mean, I'm not homemaker. That's important work. I'm certainly not suggesting for a moment that's not important work. Homemaking, taking care of children, raising kids, that is super important. But some women were also doing other things as well. And I think it's well worth starting to just open our minds a little bit and say start asking questions. Well, could women have been involved in this? And if so, how are they involved? And what role might they have played? And so on. So, I really want to examine that. And that's sort of the basic premise of the book. Yeah.
Well, listeners, I'm gonna include a link to the book and the cover. It's this really cool cover of a Viking woman. Is that a specific Viking woman on the cover?
No, it's not. No, it's not.
Oh, it looks like it's going to be a great book. I can't wait to read it, Heather.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks so much, Sarah. It's honestly, it's such a pleasure.
Well, thank you for being here, Heather. It's been such a pleasure having you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thanks so much for this. It's been a delight.
To learn more about Gudrid the Well-Traveled, see some quotes from this episode, and some artistic depictions of Gudrid, head on over to broadsyoushouldknow.com. While you're there, click on over to the About page to read more about Heather Pringle and her upcoming book, The Northwomen, Untold Stories from the Other Half of the Viking World. Are you following Broads You Should Know on social? We are on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube at Broads You Should Know. Subscribe, like, comment, and we're on Twitter at BYSK Podcast. To suggest a broad, fill out the form on our website or email us at broadsyoushouldknow@gmail.com. If you are a fan of this podcast, I ask you, help spread the word about us by sharing an episode with your friends or family, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That really does help new listeners to find us. Broads You Should Know is produced and edited by me, with original music by Darren Callahan. Finally, if you really enjoyed this episode about Gudrid the Well-Traveled, then I highly recommend you check out a few of our other broads we've covered, including Olga of Kiev, the other Viking broad, Sacagawea, another amazing explorer across North America, and Dervla Murphy, the travel writer who bicycled all the way from Ireland to India. We'll see you next week for another Broad You Should Know.